There I was again, in the same communications post I had occupied for 3 months, watching the monitors that continuously recorded the white noise of the North Atlantic. The sky above the NNS Valkyrie couldn't have been grayer, perfectly reflecting my mood on that cold, damp morning. As Lieutenant Magnus Larson, a communications specialist, I was accustomed to the monotony of seabed mapping missions, long hours monitoring frequencies, cataloging normal marine life noises, and occasionally intercepting communications from other ships. Nothing that justified the constant state of alert that protocol demanded. I stretched my neck, trying to relieve the tension caused by hours in the same position. The communications room was a small cubicle filled with equipment, screens, and the constant hum of monitoring systems. My 12-hour shift was nearly over, and I was dreaming of my bunk and a few hours of sleep. I was about to get up to grab a cup of coffee when I noticed it. A barely perceptible sound, different from the usual white noise. A beep. Faint. Rhythmic. A pattern began to emerge from the chaos of underwater sounds we typically picked up. I adjusted my headphones, increasing the volume and filtering frequencies to isolate that specific signal. My heart started to race as the pattern became clearer. Years of training made me instantly recognize what I was hearing. A classic S.O.S. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. The universal distress call. "Captain," I called over the internal comms, trying to keep my voice professional despite the adrenaline now coursing through my body. "I'm picking up a signal that requires your attention." I didn't have to wait long. Captain Erickson, a tall and lean man in his 50s, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to have seen everything the sea had to offer, was by my side in less than 2 minutes. His presence, as always, brought an immediate calm to the room. The captain listened for a moment, his face as impassive as ever. "Origin?" was his only question. "Working on it, sir." My fingers danced across the keyboard as I calibrated the directional sensors and tried to triangulate the source of the signal. The algorithms processed the data, but something didn't seem right. "It's strange. The transmission pattern doesn't match current protocols." That was the moment I first felt that something truly unusual was happening. As I analyzed the signal more closely, I began to notice peculiarities in the modulation, the timing between transmissions, small details that would go unnoticed by an untrained ear. But I had studied the evolution of naval codes since World War II as part of my specialized training. "Sir," I said, feeling a chill run down my spine, "this is a U.S. naval code, but it's not current." Captain Erickson, usually unshakable, furrowed his brow. "How old?" I analyzed a few more seconds of the transmission, comparing it with historical patterns stored in our database. Based on the sequence and modulation, I'd say from the 1950s. It's a format that was discontinued after the Korean War. A heavy silence fell over the communications room. The captain and I both knew what that meant. Either someone was deliberately using an obsolete code or, well, the alternative was difficult to accept rationally. "Can you determine the source?" the captain asked, his voice taking on a rare tone of urgency. "I'm trying, sir. The signal is intermittent, which makes precise triangulation difficult." I kept working, filtering out interference and isolating the specific frequency. "I have a rough direction, southwest of our current position, but the distance is still uncertain." The captain called the navigation officer, and within minutes, a small crowd had gathered in the communications room. The signal continued, like a weak but persistent heartbeat. "Any registered vessels in that area?" the captain asked the navigation officer. "Negative, sir. The nearest maritime traffic is at least 100 nautical miles away." For the next hour, I worked relentlessly to refine the signal's location. The S.O.S. pattern continued, always the same, always at the same rhythm. As if it were programmed, or as if someone were mechanically pressing the same button over and over for how long? Finally, I managed to pinpoint approximate coordinates. "Captain, I have a location. Latitude 63 degrees north, longitude 30 degrees west. As we suspected, no known shipping routes. It's an area of deep waters." The captain didn't hesitate. "Mr. Haugen, adjust our course. We're going to investigate." "Sir," the executive officer interjected. "This will significantly divert us from our mapping mission." "Maritime protocol is clear," the captain responded firmly. "Any distress signal, no matter how unlikely, must be investigated. Besides," he added, looking at me, "I'm curious to know who's using a Korean War-era code in the middle of the North Atlantic." As the Valkyrie changed course, I kept monitoring the signal. In theory, as we approached the source, the signal should get stronger. And it was, but not in the way I expected. The intensity was increasing in irregular increments, as if the source were moving or pulsating. "Have you considered that it might be a natural phenomenon?" asked Lisa Haugen, our sonar operator, who had joined me in the analysis. "Maybe some kind of geological formation creating interference that just happens to resemble Morse code?" "I have considered it, but the structure is too specific," I replied, showing her the patterns on the screen. "Look at how the intervals between the sequences are perfectly uniform. That's not something nature would produce randomly." 2 hours after the initial detection, we were approaching the coordinates. The sky had darkened even further, and a storm seemed to be forming on the horizon. Typical for the North Atlantic at this time of year, the waves were hitting the hull with increasing force. "We're 2 nautical miles from the point of origin," the navigation officer reported. "Any visual contact?" the captain asked, looking out the command center window. "No ships in sight," the navigation officer responded, while several of us scanned the empty horizon with binoculars. But the signal remained, constant, insistent, like a ghost with one very specific request: help. "Mr. Larson, any change in the signal?" "Yes, sir. It's significantly stronger now. And..." I paused, double-checking my instruments to confirm what I was seeing. "It appears to be coming from underwater." That statement brought another silence to the command room. Normal radio signals don't travel well through water. For an underwater signal to reach us this clearly, it either had to be very close to the surface or exceptionally powerful. "Depth in this area?" the captain asked. "Approximately 500 meters, sir," the navigation officer responded. "Prepare the ROV," the captain ordered. The remotely operated vehicle was our best chance to find out what was happening down there. "And keep monitoring that signal. I want to know if there's any change, no matter how small." As the crew mobilized to deploy the ROV, I remained at my post, listening to that repetitive message. SOS. The same distress call that sailors had been sending for over a century. Someone asking to be rescued from the depths of the ocean. Someone using a code from a past era. Or maybe, as a reluctant part of my mind was beginning to suggest, it wasn't someone sending that signal at all. Maybe it was just an echo from the past, an electronic ghost of a forgotten tragedy, repeating its last cry for help in an endless loop. Whatever it was, we were about to find out, and something told me our lives would never be the same after this. The ROV was prepared in record time. Our technical team worked with the silent efficiency that only comes with years of practice. I watched from the command center screen as the small robotic submarine was launched into the water, its powerful lights penetrating the first layers of darkness below. "ROV operator reporting full control, Captain," announced Peterson, our underwater vehicle specialist. His hands moved with precision over the controls, guiding the ROV on its descent. "Begin a spiral scan from the estimated origin point of the signal," the captain instructed, leaning over the console to observe the images starting to appear on the main screen. The first 100 meters revealed only what we expected. Water. A few fish. The occasional underwater current visible through the suspended particles dancing in front of the cameras. The silence in the command room was notable, broken only by the constant beeping of that SOS signal that continued. 200 meters, Peterson announced, visibility decreasing. The ROV's lights now illuminated murkier water, filled with sediments and decaying organic matter. It was at that moment that Lisa Haugen, our sonar operator, abruptly straightened in her chair. "I'm picking up something on the sonar scan," she reported, adjusting her equipment controls. Her eyes never left the screen for a second. "Large. Metallic." "How large?" the captain asked, moving closer to the sonar station. "Very large, sir," Lisa replied, recalculating the dimensions. "I estimate 270 meters in length, approximately 300 meters deep. A murmur ran through the room. Metallic objects of that size weren't supposed to be on the ocean floor in an unmapped area, unless it was an undocumented shipwreck. "Direct the ROV to the sonar coordinates," the captain ordered, his voice betraying a slight tremor of either excitement or apprehension. It was hard to tell which. Peterson adjusted the ROV's course, and for several minutes we watched in silence as the small vehicle navigated through the darkness, its headlights illuminating nothing but water and more water. Then suddenly, something began to take shape on the screen. First, just a vague silhouette in the distance. Then, as the ROV approached, more defined contours. "My God," I whispered, unable to contain my reaction. "It's an aircraft carrier." "Impossible," someone murmured behind me. But there it was. A massive aircraft carrier lay on the ocean floor, partially buried in mud and sediment. Its superstructure, though corroded by time and the sea, still retained the characteristic profile of large American warships. "Sonar position confirmed," Lisa announced, her professional tone clearly affected by the sight. A large metallic object. Definitely a midway-class aircraft carrier, as far as I can determine. The captain stared at the screen, as if trying to decipher a particularly difficult puzzle. "Get an identification." Peterson maneuvered the ROV to slowly circle the hull of the fallen giant. Corrosion had taken over large areas, and marine organisms colonized others, but the ship was remarkably well preserved for something that must have been there for, well, we didn't know how long yet. "Look for markings on the hull," the captain instructed. "Anything that can identify the vessel." The ROV continued its path, circling what had once been the ship's waterline. It was a surreal sight, a colossus of human engineering reduced to an underwater carcass, a sleeping giant in the dark depths of the Atlantic. "There!" Peterson exclaimed, moving the camera closer to a section of the hull where partially visible letters could be distinguished beneath layers of sediment and marine life. Carefully, he positioned the ROV and activated the thrusters to create a small current to clear the debris. The letters began to emerge, one by one. My hands felt cold as the name finally took shape. S.O.S constellation. The name hung in the air like a ghost materialized. Everyone in the Navy knew the story of the constellation, even if only as a rumor passed between sailors after a few drinks. The aircraft carrier that mysteriously vanished during NATO exercises in 1955. No distress call, no wreckage ever found. It simply disappeared, along with its entire crew, on a foggy night. One of the great unsolved naval tragedies of the 20th century. This is impossible," the executive officer said. "The constellation was declared lost in the North Sea, not the North Atlantic." "Apparently not," the captain replied. "Continue the investigation. I want to know the condition of this ship." As Peterson guided the ROV around the hull, each new image revealed more details of this Cold War relic. The flight deck had partially collapsed in some areas but was surprisingly intact in others. An aircraft could still be seen, stuck in the remains of a deck elevator that had apparently failed. It was like looking at a time capsule, preserved in the freezing darkness of the ocean abyss. "Captain," I called out, noticing something on my monitors. "The signal is getting stronger, much stronger. It's coming directly from the ship." That caught everyone's attention again. "That's impossible," protested the chief engineer, stepping closer to my station. "No electronic equipment would function after decades underwater. The batteries would have failed within days, maybe weeks." "And yet, the signal is there," I replied, showing him the readings. "And it's coming directly from the constellation's superstructure." The captain made a quick decision. "Direct the ROV to the command tower. Find the communications room." Peterson nodded and began maneuvering the ROV toward the aircraft carrier's island. The command tower rose like a silent fortress, its broken windows resembling empty eyes staring into nothingness. The ROV found an entry point, a side hatch that had been left open or had perhaps given way upon impact when the ship sank. The vehicle slipped inside the constellation, its headlights illuminating corridors where sailors once hurried, carrying out their duties. Now, fish swam freely, exploring abandoned cabins and compartments filled with equipment no one would ever use again. Second deck, turning starboard, Peterson narrated as he guided the ROV through the ship's labyrinthine interior. We should be close to the main communications room. The images were mesmerizing and unsettling at the same time. Chairs still positioned in front of workstations. A training mannequin in a corner, its torso partially covered in algae. A framed photograph of a young woman, protected from the water by its glass, eternally gazing at a husband who never returned. There, the captain pointed, indicating a half-open door with still visible markings. Communications room. When the ROV entered that final compartment, everyone held their breath. The communications room was in a surprisingly well-preserved state. Much of the equipment remained intact, protected by an air pocket trapped in the ceiling that, through some anomaly of physics or luck, had not dissipated in nearly 70 years. And then we saw the unthinkable. The radio equipment was not just preserved, it was active. Lights flickered on the main console as if it had been powered up recently. "Zoom in on the main station," the captain requested. The ROV's camera moved closer to the radio console. The dials were still functional, their needles moving rhythmically in sync with the signal we were receiving. A red light blinked constantly, the universal indicator of an ongoing transmission. "This is scientifically impossible," murmured our chief scientist, Dr. Lindholm, who had been called to the command center. "The most durable battery in the world would have drained in days, not decades." "The meter shows a full charge," I observed as Peterson brought the camera closer to the instrument panel, as if it had been turned on or recharged recently. The captain was about to issue new instructions when I noticed something moving in the corner of the screen. It wasn't a fish, nor a reflection, nor a current of water. It was a shadow, humanoid in shape, passing quickly behind the radio console. "Wait!" I shouted, pointing at the screen. "Go back! There was something there!" "Rewind the footage!" the captain ordered. Peterson quickly played the camera feed in reverse, and we watched that moment again. But as we reviewed the video, frame by frame, there was nothing there. Just the empty room, the blinking console, and the still darkness in the unlit corners. "It must have been a light effect," someone suggested, though without much conviction. The SOS signal continued to sound in my headphones, constant and steady like clockwork. Coming from equipment that should have been dead for decades, aboard a ship that should not have been there. Captain Erickson observed the images for a few more moments. Then, he made a decision that would change our lives forever. "We have no choice," he declared, straightening up. "Prepare the dive team. We need to investigate in person." A chill ran down my spine at those words. We knew protocol required a full investigation of any unidentified wreck. But something about this situation, the impossible signal, the ship that shouldn't be there, the shadow I saw or imagined seeing, everything seemed to scream that we should keep our distance. And yet, duty prevailed. As I watched the ROV continue its exploration of the metallic ghost that was the USS Constellation, I knew that soon I would be down there too, walking through those same abandoned corridors, searching for answers to questions that perhaps were better left unanswered. I volunteered immediately for the dive team. Perhaps out of scientific curiosity, perhaps out of an inexplicable need to uncover the truth behind that ghost signal. Or maybe because, as the first to detect the transmission, I felt a strange personal responsibility. Whatever the reason, 3 hours later, I found myself in the Valkyrie's decompression chamber alongside Reeves, our senior diver, and Nakamura, a specialist in underwater recovery. "Remember, you have oxygen for 90 minutes, the captain instructed through the intercom. "The priority is the communications room. Document everything, but do not disturb anything until you receive explicit authorization." I adjusted my equipment one last time. The deep-sea diving suit was heavy and cumbersome on the surface, but it would be my only protection against the crushing pressure and paralyzing cold of the depths. Each team member carried high-definition cameras attached to their helmets and powerful flashlights mounted on their wrists. "Everyone ready?" Reeves asked, his voice slightly muffled by the internal communication system. Nakamura and I nodded. Water began to flood the chamber, rising quickly around us. I took several deep breaths, controlling the natural anxiety that every diver feels, no matter how experienced. When the chamber was fully submerged, the lower hatch opened and we began our descent. At first, we could see the hull of the Valkyrie above us, its lights becoming increasingly diffused as we sank into the darkness. The descent felt like entering another world, a primordial world, one that existed before light, before life as we knew it on the surface. The darkness was nearly absolute, broken only by our beams and the occasional bioluminescent creatures drifting like ghosts in the black vastness. 200 meters, Nakamura reported, checking his depth gauge. Constellation should appear at any moment. And then, it emerged below us. The aircraft carrier loomed out of the darkness like a sleeping giant, far larger and more imposing than it had seemed through the ROV's cameras. It was as if we were floating above a sunken city, a metropolis swallowed by the ocean, with its inhabitants still inside. "My God," Reeves whispered. "It's magnificent." Magnificent and terrifying at the same time. We made our way to the same entrance the ROV had used, the side hatch at the base of the command tower. Up close, we could see the toll 7 decades had taken on the metal. Advanced corrosion, barnacles covering large sections, small cracks through which marine life moved freely. "Maintain constant visual contact," Reeves instructed as we entered the ship's interior, "and report anything unusual immediately." We followed the same path the ROV had traced hours before. When we reached the communications room, we all involuntarily held our breath. It was exactly as we had seen through the ROV's cameras, but being there in person was an entirely different experience. The radio equipment was still intact, protected by an air pocket trapped in the ceiling that defied every law of physics I knew, and, even more impossibly, the lights on the console were still blinking. "This is..." Nakamura hesitated, clearly struggling to find the words. "This shouldn't be possible." Reeves cautiously approached the console. "The air pocket explains the preservation of the equipment, but not how it's still operational." "The meter shows a full charge," I observed, bringing my flashlight closer, as if it had been powered on or recharged recently. We began methodically documenting everything, filming every inch of the room. That's when I noticed the radio log, still clipped to the side of the main console. I approached cautiously, illuminating the pages with my flashlight. Surprisingly, some of the text was still legible, protected by the air pocket and the special type of naval record paper designed to resist moisture. Carefully, I flipped through the pages until I reached the last entry. The date was clear: November 17th, 1955. And below it, in hurried handwriting, was written, "Unknown signal detected. Origin, undetermined. Estimated depth, 3,000 meters. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the icy water. Had the constellation detected a signal too? A signal coming from something even deeper? At the exact moment I read those words, as if responding to an invisible cue, the radio stopped. The lights went out. The room was plunged into darkness, interrupted only by our flashlights. "What happened?" Reeves asked, turning to the now dead console. "I don't know," I replied. "It was working, and then it just stopped." It was then that I felt something touch my shoulder. A firm, deliberate touch, like a human hand. I spun around abruptly, my heart pounding in my chest, my flashlight beam cutting through the water in a wide arc. There was no one there. Reeves and Nakamura were on the other side of the room, examining a side panel. I was alone in that corner. "Did you see anything?" I asked, my voice betraying my unease. "No," Nakamura replied. "Why?" Before I could answer, something caught my attention in the corridor outside the communications room. A faint light, different from our flashlights. Softer, bluish, moving slowly down the corridor as if floating. "We have company," I said, pointing toward the hallway. Reeves and Nakamura turned quickly, their beams converging in the direction I indicated. But when their lights reached the corridor, there was nothing there, only water and darkness. "We're all on edge," Reeves commented. "This place, something is wrong with it. We need to finish our mission and get back to the surface." We silently agreed. In the next 20 minutes, we completed our communications room documentation and collected a few small samples that might help explain the phenomenon of the functional equipment. No one mentioned what I had seen, or thought I had seen. The way back to the surface was the longest of my life. No one spoke during the ascent, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we had witnessed. When we finally emerged into the Valkyrie's decompression chamber, I felt as though I was returning from another dimension. The debriefing with Captain Erickson lasted for hours. We reviewed all the footage and discussed every detail of what we had found. The captain rubbed his face, clearly exhausted. "Gentlemen, ma'am," he said, addressing our small team, "what we discovered today goes far beyond our current understanding. I'm declaring this incident top-level classified until further notice." In the following days, specialized teams arrived at the Valkyrie. Men and women in civilian clothes, but with the unmistakable posture of high-ranking military officers or intelligence agents. They conducted long interviews with us, took all the evidence we had collected, and then, as mysteriously as they had arrived, left. Our mapping mission was officially canceled. We were ordered to return to the nearest naval base immediately. The USS Constellation incident, as it came to be known among the crew, would never be officially mentioned. Today, as I write this personal report, I know it will never be filed in the Navy's official records. The authorities have already created their narrative. The Constellation was never found, and it remains an unsolved naval mystery. The S.O.S signal we detected was classified as a rare electromagnetic phenomenon, an anomaly caused by the interaction between ocean currents and specific geological formations. The scientists called to analyze our data theorize about isolated air pockets that preserved the equipment, about bioelectric currents generated by colonies of specialized bacteria, about anything except the truth of what we saw. While for the world the mystery continues, for those of us who were there remains a disturbing certainty. Something happened to the USS Constellation in 1955. Something that cannot be explained by current scientific paradigms. They found something in the depths, something that perhaps should not have been found. And by answering its call, we too became part of that mystery. At night, when sleep doesn't come, I still hear that ethereal hum in my mind. One thing is certain. What the USS Constellation found in those waters in 1955. What remains to be seen is what this means for us, and for the rest of humanity.